A single ship rides low in the dark water, alone on a sea that stretches to every horizon, its sail torn, its oars manned by fewer hands with each passing year. Somewhere behind it lies the smoking ruin of a city that took 10 years to conquer. Somewhere ahead, though its captain does not yet know how far ahead, lies a stone house on a rocky island, a wife who is not remarried, and a son who was only a baby when his father sailed away and is now nearly a man grown. Between the ship and that home stand a blinded giant with a grudge passed down from his father, the sea god, a witch who turns sailors into swine, a monster with 6 heads rooted to a cliff, a whirlpool that can swallow a ship whole, and a nymph who wants nothing more than to keep this one mortal man forever. What does it cost a man to find his way home when every god and monster in creation seems to stand between him and his own front door? This is the story of Odysseus, king of the small rocky island of Ithaca, the most cunning man to fight at Troy, and the 10 years it took him to sail a distance that should have taken weeks. It is a story about a war that was already, technically, over, and about how winning a war and finding a way home from one turned out to be 2 very different struggles. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps this channel, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. Now let the sail fill, and let the long voyage begin. Troy had fallen at last after 10 grinding years of siege, brought down not by force of arms, but by a hollow wooden horse and the cunning mind of one Greek captain, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, a small green island in the western sea, a man prized less for his spear than for his quick tongue and quicker schemes. With Troy burning behind them, he loaded his men and plunder onto 12 black ships and turned the prows west, expecting the easy voyage a sailor might expect from hugging the coast in a calm season. He could not have known that Poseidon was already watching him, or that a decade would pass before he saw his own shore again. The first stop was Ismarus, a city belonging to the Sirens, allies of Troy, and Odysseus and his men did what returning warriors of that age simply did. They sacked it, driving off livestock and loading plunder onto the ships. His men urged him to leave before the Sirens could rally a response. Flush with the ease of the raid, Odysseus refused and let his crews linger on the beach through the night, feasting on captured wine under the stars. By morning, the Sirens returned in far greater numbers than anyone expected, reinforced by neighboring tribesmen, and fell on the feasting Greeks before the ships could be launched. 6 men from each ship died on that beach, a bitter cost for one night's excess, and the survivors fled to open water with the cries of the dead still ringing behind them. It was the first hard lesson of the voyage. Appetite for plunder or wine or one more hour on a pleasant shore was a debt that always came due. Worse followed almost immediately. Zeus sent a storm down on the fleeing fleet. A wind so violent it tore the sails to rags and drove the ships blind across open water for 2 days and nights, the sailors clinging to the rigging while thunder cracked overhead. When the storm finally broke, no one aboard could have said where in the wide sea they now floated, and already Ithaca felt impossibly far away. 3 days after the storm released them, the fleet made landfall on a quiet coast where the local people, gentle and incurious, showed no interest in war or plunder. These were the lotus eaters, and their whole way of life centered on a single plant, a sweet fruit and flower that grew wild along their shore, one that carried a strange and terrible gift. Odysseus sent 3 men ashore to scout the land. Ordinary reconnaissance performed 100 times already on this voyage. The lotus eaters greeted them kindly and offered them the fruit of their land, and the moment the sailors tasted it, something in them changed. Sweeter than any honey they had known, the lotus brought with it a drowsy, perfect contentment that swallowed every other thought. No memory of Ithaca, no ache for home, only the wish to sit down among the lotus eaters and never stand up again. When the rest of the landing party found them, their shipmates were smiling and vacant, wanting only more of the fruit and the endless golden afternoon it promised. Odysseus understood the danger at once and gave the order, drag them back to the ships by force, and bind them beneath the rowing benches until the drugged sweetness wore off and their tears came back along with their memory. The fleet put out to sea again without delay. It was a small, quiet danger compared to what lay ahead. No monster, no violence, nothing that looked like an enemy at all. Only a sweetness so complete that a man could forget, gladly, that he had ever had a home worth returning to. Beyond the land of the lotus, Eaters lay an island thick with wild grapevines and untended grain, a green place that seemed to farm itself, and just across a narrow channel rose a stranger, harder country, the land of the cyclops, one-eyed giants who lived without law or assembly, each ruling his own cave and his own flock and answering to no one. Curiosity, or the hope of hospitality, pulled Odysseus toward that second shore. Leaving most of his ships anchored at the Green Island, he took one vessel and its crew of 12 across the channel, carrying with him a skin of extraordinarily potent wine, a gift from a priest of Apollo, dark and strong enough that it was normally diluted 20 parts water to 1. Something told him it might prove useful before the day was through. On the far shore, they found a vast cave near the water's edge, its mouth screened by tall laurel trees, its floor littered with the pens of a shepherd on an enormous scale, cheese racks groaning under their load, pails of milk large enough to bathe a child in, lambs penned in wicker enclosures built for hands far larger than any man's. The owner was away in the hills with his flocks. Against his own instincts, and despite his men begging him to take what food they needed and slip away, Odysseus chose to wait. Curious, he would later admit, to see what manner of host this cave belonged to, hoping for gifts of the kind a stranger was owed under the old laws of hospitality. It was a choice, born of pride as much as curiosity, that his men would soon have every reason to regret. As the light outside the cave began to fail, the ground itself seemed to shudder, and a shadow fell across the entrance large enough to blot out the evening sky. The giant who filled the cave mouth was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, a shepherd the size of a hillside with a single vast eye set in the middle of his forehead. He drove his flocks in and heaved a boulder across the entrance, a stone so massive that 22 carts and oxen together could not have dragged it aside, sealing Odysseus and his 12 men inside with no way out but through their host. Once his chores were finished, Polyphemus noticed the strangers near the cheese racks and asked, in a voice that shook dust from the roof, who they were. Odysseus named himself a Greek returning from Troy and appealed to the ancient law that any host owed a stranger food, shelter, and safe passage. Protected, he reminded the giant, by Zeus himself. Polyphemus only laughed, a huge, contemptuous sound, and said the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus, since they were stronger than every god. Then, before another word could be spoken, he seized 2 of the sailors and made a meal of them where the others could see it happen, before lying down among his flock to sleep off his supper, unconcerned by whatever trembling strangers might do while he snored. Odysseus wanted in that first raw moment to drive his sword into the sleeping giant's chest. Only a colder thought stopped his hand. A killing blow would trap the rest of them forever behind that boulder, sealed alive with the corpse, and no way to move a stone, only the giant's strength could shift. Through that long night, and the following day while Polyphemus was out with his flock, Odysseus turned a single plan over, testing it the way a man tests ice before trusting his weight to it. In the corner stood a green olive trunk the giant had cut for a staff, roughly the size of a ship's mast. While their captor was away, the men sharpened one end to a point, hardened it in the fire, and hid the stake beneath a pile of dung to wait for nightfall. When Polyphemus returned and ate 2 more men, grief settled over Odysseus like a physical weight, even as he kept to the plan. Before the giant could settle for the night, Odysseus offered him a bowl of dark, unwatered wine from the ship. Polyphemus drank it, found it better than anything he had tasted, and demanded more, growing looser with every bowl, until at last, half drunk and almost friendly, he asked the stranger's name and promised a guest gift in return. He would, he said with a low rumbling laugh, eat this one last of all. Odysseus answered with the cleverest lie of the voyage. My name, he said, is nobody. That is what my mother and father call me, and what all my friends call me too." "Very well, nobody," the giant said, sliding into a wine-soaked sleep among his sheep. "I will eat you, last of your companions. That will be my gift to you." Once the giant had slid into a heavy, wine-thick sleep, Odysseus and his remaining men drew the stake from its hiding place and held its point in the fire until it glowed close to catching, keeping their hands steady, though every one of them was shaking. Then, with a strength born of grief and 2 nights of watching their friends devoured, they drove the point home and turned it, the way a shipwright turns a drill through a beam, and the cave filled with a single tremendous cry that seemed to shake dust from the stone overhead. That was the whole of it, a scream in the dark, and then a giant, staggering blind among his own sheep, groping at the walls while the small men who had done this pressed themselves flat and silent into the shadows. Roused by that cry, the other cyclopes, scattered across the hillside, came running and called through the sealed boulder, asking what enemy attacked him. "Nobody is attacking me," Polyphemus bellowed back through his agony, not knowing how completely he had betrayed himself. His neighbors, hearing no one was troubling him, decided he must be suffering some private madness sent by the gods and returned to their own caves. Blind and desperate, Polyphemus rolled the boulder from the cave mouth the next morning and sat in the entrance with arms spread wide, certain no man could sneak past a doorway he guarded with his own hands. But Odysseus had spent the night preparing for exactly that. He bound his surviving men, 3 to a row, beneath the bellies of the giant's thick-fleeced rams, and for himself chose the largest ram, clinging beneath its belly by hand and by will alone, as it was driven out at dawn. Polyphemus ran his hands over the back of every sheep as it passed, but never once thought to feel underneath, and one by one the rams carrying hidden men filed past him toward the shore. Not until the ship was already pushing off did Odysseus call back and taunt the blinded giant roaring on the beach, a moment of pride he would come to regret. Provoked past reason, Polyphemus tore the peak from a nearby hillside and hurled it toward the sound of that voice, a boulder large enough to nearly swamp the ship, and when Odysseus, unable to help himself, shouted his true name in triumph, Odysseus, sacker of cities, king of Ithaca, the giant went suddenly, terribly still. He knew that name. An old prophecy had warned him. A man called Odysseus would someday take his sight, though he had pictured some great warrior, not the clever stranger who tricked him with wine and a false name. Then Polyphemus lifted both huge hands to the sky and called out to his father, the god of the sea, and asked, not for his eye back, for that was already lost, but that Odysseus never reach home at all, or arrive late, broken, alone, having lost every companion, to find nothing but grief in his own house. Poseidon, ruler of every sea, Odysseus would now have to cross, heard every word. From the island of the Cyclopes, grieving for the men Polyphemus had eaten, the fleet sailed on to a floating island ringed by bronze cliffs, home to Aeolus, keeper of the winds, favored by the gods with the strange gift of commanding every wind in the sky. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus warmly, hosted the crew for a month, and when it came time to leave, gave his guest a parting gift unlike any other on the journey, an oxhide bag bound with a silver cord holding every contrary wind in creation, leaving only the gentle west wind free to blow the ships home. "Do not open this bag," Aeolus warned, "until Ithaca's shore rises ahead of you." For 9 days it worked exactly as promised, the west wind carrying the fleet so steadily that on the 10th day Odysseus could see Ithaca itself. Smoke rising from familiar hills, close enough to make out fires along the coast he had left 10 years before. Worn out from 9 sleepless days gripping the tiller himself, he finally let his eyes close, certain the hardest part was behind him. While he slept, his crew, who had spent the voyage whispering that the bag must hold gold their captain meant to keep for himself, gave in to curiosity and untied the cord. Every trapped wind roared out at once, a howling gale that drove the ships back across the distance they had just crossed, undoing 9 days of progress in a single night. When the battered fleet limped back to Aeolus's island a second time, the king refused even to hear the story through. Someone hated by the gods this badly was not a man he dared help again. The west wind that had once seemed so close was gone, and Ithaca dropped back below the horizon. What followed was one of the deadliest single days of the entire voyage, though it receives little space in most retellings. 6 days of hard rowing brought the fleet to a harbor unlike any Odysseus had seen. A long, narrow inlet walled by sheer cliffs, so still and sheltered that 11 of his 12 captains steered straight in and tied up along the calm shore inside. Odysseus alone, wary after everything the voyage had already cost him, moored his own ship outside the harbor mouth, unwilling to trust a shelter that seemed too perfect. He sent 3 men ashore, and what they found was the kingdom of the Laestrygonians, giants far larger and less inclined to conversation than even Polyphemus had been. The scouting party met the local king's daughter first, drawing water at a spring, who led them straight into a hall where her father seized one man and made a meal of him before the others could turn to run. The alarm went up across the settlement, and Laestrygonians came pouring down from the cliffs by the hundreds, hurling boulders onto the trapped ships with strength enough to shatter hulls, others wading in to spear the swimming survivors. Trapped in that narrow harbor with cliffs too steep to climb, 11 of the 12 ships and every man aboard them were destroyed within minutes. Odysseus, watching from his ship outside the harbor, cut the mooring rope himself and shouted for his crew to row as they had never rowed before. They escaped, but at a cost almost too large to comprehend. 11 ships gone, hundreds of men who had survived 10 years at Troy and this entire voyage besides, lost inside a single quiet-looking harbor in less time than it takes to tell the story. From a fleet of 12 ships, only one now remained. With a single battered ship and a crew reduced to a broken handful of the men who had sailed from Troy, Odysseus found his way to a green hidden island called Aea, ruled by the enchantress Circe, daughter of the sun. A story eventful enough in its own right that it has been told in full elsewhere on this channel, and so only the shape of it belongs here. She tested the crew cruelly at first, then took them in, and Odysseus and his surviving men stayed nearly a year, healing in ways that went beyond the merely physical, before continuing on. It was Circe who gave him the strangest instruction of the entire voyage before he could sail for Ithaca, she said. He would first have to sail to the edge of the world and descend, while still living, into the gray and sunless kingdom of the dead, to consult the blind prophet Tiresias, the one shade whose mind the underworld had left whole, because only he could tell him the rest of the road home. It was not the kind of guidance any sailor wanted, and not a request Odysseus could safely refuse. When the time came to leave Aea, his men wept from simple exhaustion at what still lay ahead, and the ship pointed its prow not toward Ithaca, but toward the farthest, darkest edge of the known world. No ship had ever sailed where Odysseus now pointed his, and no living crew had ever meant to return from where they were going. Circe's directions carried them across the river of Ocean, the vast, dim water the Greeks believed encircled the world, to a shore where no sun properly rose, a place of low mist and gray light where night and day blurred together, and the wind, when it blew, carried a chill that had nothing to do with any ordinary season. Beaching the ship on that joyless coast, Odysseus led 2 men inland to the spot Circe had described, where 2 rivers met before pouring into the underworld, and there he dug a pit exactly as instructed, a trench no longer than a man's arm. Into it he poured offerings meant to draw the dead, milk mixed with honey, sweet wine, plain water, and a scattering of barley meal, the same simple foods any household might offer at its hearth. Then came the part he dreaded most. A black ram and a black ewe, sacrificed at the lip of the pit, let their blood run down into the earth, and the moment it touched the soil, the dead began to come. They rose out of the mist in their hundreds, brides who had died before their wedding day, young men cut down before they had lived enough of their lives, old warriors still bearing the wounds that killed them, all crowding toward the smell of blood with a low, papery murmur that raised the hair on his neck. He held to Circe's warning, sword drawn, keeping every shade back from the trench until the one he had come for finally appeared. Even before Tiresias arrived, one face pushed forward that Odysseus had not expected and could hardly bear to see, his own mother, Anticlea, whom he had left alive and well on Ithaca 10 years before, her presence here telling him something he had not let himself imagine. Tiresias came forward at last, recognizable among the crowding dead by the golden staff he still carried. And once he had drunk from the offered blood and found his voice restored, he told Odysseus plainly that the road home was still long, and that Poseidon had not forgiven him for the blinding of his son. There was a way through, the prophet said, but only one. When the ship reached the island of Thrinacia, where the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios grazed under careful watch, the crew would have to leave those animals entirely untouched, no matter how desperate their hunger became. Harm even one, Tiresias warned, and every man aboard would die before ever seeing Ithaca again. And even if Odysseus alone survived, he would arrive home late, alone, aboard a stranger's ship to find his household in disorder and strangers eating through his stores. Only after Tiresias withdrew did Odysseus let his mother's shade approach the blood, and what she told him broke something the whole war at Troy had left intact. She had not died of illness or age, she said, but of longing, the slow wasting grief of a woman who watched the horizon every day for a son who never came, until the waiting became more than her heart could carry. She spoke too of Penelope, still faithful despite years of pressure to remarry, and of Telemachus, the infant he had left behind, now a young man holding his father's house together against men who wanted to tear it apart. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace her, and 3 times his arms closed on nothing but mist, and he understood then exactly what death had cost them both. Other shades came forward before he fled that place. The great warrior Achilles, who said he would rather serve as a landless farmhand than rule over all the dead, and Agamemnon, murdered in his own bath the day he came home, who warned him never to trust a homecoming completely, never to let down his guard inside his own front door. Odysseus then turned his back on that gray, murmuring crowd and led his men up toward the ship and the ordinary light of the living world. Returning to Aeaea briefly to bury a crewman and receive Circe's final warnings, Odysseus learned what still lay ahead, the island of the Sirens, a hazard unlike any monster or storm because it killed not through force, but through beauty. No ship had ever passed that shore and lived to describe what those creatures actually sang, only that every sailor who heard it steered straight for the rocks, drawn by a song so perfect it erased every other wish a man ever had, until his ship broke apart on stones littered with the bones of everyone who had listened before him. Circe had given Odysseus a way to hear that song and survive it, and as the island came into view, a low, sun-bright shore, deceptively pleasant, ringed with white rocks and what looked from a distance like a meadow of soft grass, he followed her instructions exactly. Softened beeswax was pressed into the ears of every rowing man until the crew sailed in a private, muffled silence, hearing nothing beyond the creak of the oars. For himself, Odysseus chose differently, wanting to hear the song no living man had survived. Hearing, he had his crew lash him tightly to the mast, hand and foot, and made them swear that no matter how he begged once the singing began, they would only bind him tighter. At first, there was nothing but the ordinary hush of open water. Then, faint and carried on the wind before any words could be made out, came a sound that seemed to rise directly out of the sea itself, low and sweet and achingly familiar, as though it already somehow knew his name. As the ship drew closer, the sound sharpened into 2 or 3 voices woven together, singing to him directly, praising his own glory at Troy in words so precisely tuned to his deepest pride that every rational thought bent toward the rocks. He strained against the ropes until they cut his skin, begging with his eyes to be released to swim toward that voice. His men, deaf to everything but the oars, only rowed harder and bound him tighter, exactly as ordered, and slowly the ship pulled the singing back into the distance until it faded into the ordinary sound of wind and water. No sooner had the siren's song faded than a new sound reached the ship, a deep, rhythmic roar rising from somewhere ahead, water striking rock with a violence that grew louder with every stroke of the oars. Circe had warned Odysseus about this stretch more carefully than almost anything else. A strait so narrow, a ship could not avoid passing close to both sides at once, guarded by two dangers that could not both be dodged. High in a cliff face slick with mist, unreachable by any climber, lived Scylla, a monster with 6 long necks and 6 snapping heads, who could reach down and snatch 6 men from a passing deck in the time it took to draw a breath. On the other side, the sea itself became the enemy. Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that swallowed the ocean 3 times a day and spat it back out, capable of pulling an entire ship down into the depths. There was no way through that, avoided both, and Circe had told him to steer close to Scylla's side and accept the loss of 6 men rather than risk the ship whole. Unwilling to explain that to a crew already exhausted by grief, Odysseus said nothing of Scylla and ordered them to row as hard as they could. As the ship threaded the gap, every eye strained toward the swirling black water of Charybdis, mesmerized by a sound like the whole ocean groaning. And while every man's attention was fixed there, Scylla struck from the opposite cliff without warning. 6 heads shot down out of the mist, and the roar of water covered whatever cries came next. When Odysseus turned, he saw only his 6 chosen men lifted high against the rock face, already beyond hope, calling his name as the ship carried the rest of the crew onward and out of reach. It was, he would say afterward, the single worst moment of the voyage. A trade made with his own hand, 6 lives spent to save the rest, grief he carried the whole remaining distance home. Battered and grieving, the ship reached Thrinacia, the island Tiresias had warned him about most, urgently. A green pasture land where the cattle of the sun god Helios grazed under a wide open sky, animals that never bred and never truly died, tended eternally by the god's own daughters. Odysseus wanted to sail past without setting foot there, remembering the prophet's warning word for word. But his men, exhausted and desperate for solid ground, begged so hard for a single night's rest that he relented, making everyone swear an oath. First, whatever food they found, they would not touch the sacred cattle. For a month, contrary winds trapped them there, stores dwindling until the last of the bread and wine Circe had given them ran out. Odysseus walked inland alone to pray for a way off the island, and while he was gone, hunger did what 10 years of war and monsters had not managed. It broke his men's discipline entirely. Led by Eurylochus, the starving crew reasoned that a single sacrifice, with proper prayers and a promised temple once home, could hardly matter. Better to die at sea from Helios's anger, they told each other, than starve on a beach with meat grazing in plain sight. They killed the finest cattle they could catch and feasted for 6 days, while Odysseus, returning to find the deed done, could only watch in despair. High above, Helios saw his herd slaughtered and demanded justice from Zeus, promising that if the crime went unpunished, he would shine in the underworld instead and leave the earth in permanent night. Zeus promised satisfaction. The moment the ship put back out to sea, a sudden storm rose from nowhere, snapped the mast, and struck the hull with a thunderbolt that threw every man into the churning water. Only Odysseus survived, lashing the broken mast and keel into a makeshift raft, drifting for days, past the very strait where Scylla and Charybdis waited, narrowly escaping both again by a desperate grip on an overhanging fig tree until the current carried him, exhausted and alone, toward a shore he did not yet recognize. The shore that finally received him belonged to the nymph Calypso, who ruled a hidden island called Ogygia, a green, sheltered paradise fragrant with cedar smoke and wild violets, its beaches empty of any other living soul. Calypso found the shipwrecked stranger half drowned on her sand and took him in, and what began as simple rescue became, over the years that followed, something more complicated. She wanted to keep him. Years passed on her island in a way that blurred one season into the next, Calypso offering him a kind of immortality most mortal men would have seized without a second thought, a life free of aging and death, spent forever at her side. Odysseus never wanted it. Each morning he walked down to the same stretch of shore and sat looking out at a sea that led, somewhere far beyond the horizon, to a rocky little island, and a wife and son he had not seen in going on 20 years, and each night he returned to her cave with his heart no closer to home than it had been that morning. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the cruelest stretches of the entire voyage. Not a monster, not a battle, but 7 long years of comfort that felt, to a man who wanted only to go home, like its own kind of prison. What finally changed his fortune had nothing to do with anything he did. On Olympus, the goddess Athena, who had favored Odysseus since Troy, pressed his case before Zeus while Poseidon happened to be away, arguing that 7 years of exile was punishment enough for one moment of pride shouted across open water. Zeus agreed and sent Hermes down with a command Calypso could not refuse, however much it grieved her: release him. She obeyed, helping him build a sturdy raft and supplying it with food, water, and wine, and stood on her shore watching him sail away for good. Poseidon, finding the man he had cursed still alive and now free of Calypso's island besides, raised one final storm against him, battering the raft to splinters and leaving Odysseus swimming for his life for 2 full days, saved only by a sea goddess's veil that kept him afloat until he washed up exhausted on the shore of Scheria, land of the Phaeacians, a seafaring people famous even among the gods for their ships. He woke to the sound of young women laughing at a stream nearby, where the princess Nausicaa and her attendants had come to wash linens, and the shipwrecked stranger who emerged from the bushes won the young princess's sympathy at once. She gave him clothing, fed him, and sent him toward her father's palace with instructions on how to win a welcome there. King Alcinous and Queen Arete received him with a hospitality unlike anything since Troy, offering him a seat at their table without even asking his name, and that evening, at a feast held in his honor, a blind court singer performed songs of the Trojan War so vivid that Odysseus, listening in the firelight, could not stop his tears. Asked at last who he was, he gave his true name to a hall full of strangers, and told them the entire tale of everything since Troy fell: the Cyclones, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, Aeolus, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of the sun, and 7 years on Calypso's island. By the time he finished, King Alcinous had decided what to do: give this guest a ship of his own, crewed by his best oarsmen and loaded with gifts of bronze and gold, and send him to Ithaca that very night. Odysseus, worn past the point of staying awake for 1 more mile of the journey he had waited 20 years to complete, fell into a sleep so deep it resembled death itself, while the Phaeacian ship cut through calm water under a sky full of stars, and he did not wake even when it touched the shore of his own island, its crew carrying him gently onto the sand beside the very cove where, as a boy, he had once played. Odysseus woke on a beach he did not, at first, recognize. So many years had passed since he had last stood on that sand, and it took the goddess Athena herself, lifting a strange mist from his eyes, to convince him he had truly, finally arrived on Ithaca. There was no triumphant homecoming waiting for him, though only a household in crisis. Over 100 arrogant young noblemen from Ithaca and the surrounding islands had moved into his own palace during his 20-year absence, eating through his stores, drinking his wine, and pressuring his wife Penelope to give up hope and marry one of them, certain that Odysseus was dead and his kingdom simply waiting to be claimed. Athena warned him plainly that walking into his own hall as himself would likely get him killed before he understood the shape of the danger, and so she disguised him instead, transforming the once proud king into a stooped, weathered old beggar, his fine clothes replaced with rags so he could move through his own kingdom unrecognized and learn who among his household had stayed loyal. In that disguise, Odysseus made his way first to the hut of Eumaeus, his old swineherd, a humble, honest man who had no idea he was offering food and shelter to his own long-lost king, and who spoke of his missing master with a loyalty and grief so genuine that Odysseus, listening from behind his disguise, had to look away to hide what the words did to his face. It was there that he was finally reunited with his son, Telemachus, the infant he had left 20 years before, now a young man grown, returning from a journey of his own to search for news of his missing father. Athena lifted the disguise just long enough for father and son to know each other, and the two wept together in that swineherd's hut, a reunion held in secret, far from the palace where 100 suitors sat feasting on a dead man's stores without the faintest idea he had already come home. Before he walked toward his own front door, Odysseus and Telemachus made a plan together, quiet, careful, and dangerous, for what would happen once the beggar finally crossed that threshold. Disguised once more as a beggar, Odysseus walked the last stretch of road toward the palace he had built with his own hands as a young king, and the first creature in his household to know him was not a person at all. Lying neglected on a heap of manure by the gate was Argos, the hunting dog he had raised and trained just before sailing for Troy, now old, flea-bitten, and abandoned by everyone except his memory of a master gone 20 years. As the disguised king passed close enough, the old dog's ears lifted, and though he had no strength left to stand, Argos wagged his tail and lowered his head, recognizing at once the one person the rest of the household could not see. And then, that small act of recognition, apparently the last thing he had been waiting for, the old dog died right there in the dirt. Forbidden by his own plan from showing any reaction, Odysseus wiped a single tear and kept walking, unable even to pause over the one being in his kingdom who had known him at first glance. Inside the hall, the suitors treated the ragged old beggar exactly as they treated everyone beneath their notice, with mockery, shoves, and a thrown footstool from one of the crueler young men. Odysseus absorbed it in silence, cataloging each humiliation with a patience that would later prove costly to the men doing the mocking. Penelope, hearing that a strange beggar claiming news of her long-missing husband had entered the hall, sent for him privately and questioned him gently, moved despite herself by his careful answers, though she had no way of knowing she was speaking to Odysseus himself, only inches away after 20 years apart. She told him she could not put off the suitors much longer, and that she had decided on a contest. Whichever man could string her husband's great hunting bow and shoot an arrow through the sockets of 12 axe heads set in a row would become her new husband, a test chosen carefully and privately because she suspected, though she could not say why, that no man in that hall but her true husband had ever been strong enough to string it. Later that night, as an old servant knelt to wash the beggar's feet as hospitality required, her hands found an old scar on his leg, one she remembered from decades earlier, and gasping, she nearly cried his name aloud before Odysseus, gripping her wrist, begged her in a fierce whisper to keep his secret only a little while longer. The next day, Penelope brought out the great bow before the assembled suitors and laid down the terms of the contest exactly as she had described them to the beggar in private. One by one, the young noblemen who had spent years feasting in Odysseus's hall stepped forward to try their strength against a weapon that had belonged to a king 20 years gone, and one by one they failed even to bend it enough to fit the string, some straining until red-faced, others giving up almost at once, embarrassed before the woman they were so certain they would soon marry. When every suitor had failed, the ragged old beggar in the corner asked, with careful humility, whether he might be permitted a single attempt of his own, greeted with laughter and open contempt. Odysseus took the bow into his hands as though remembering the weight of an old friend, and with no visible strain, bent it, strung it, and sent a single arrow clean through all 12 axe heads in a line, a shot so effortless the hall fell into a stunned, uneasy silence before anyone quite understood what they had witnessed. In the quiet that followed, the beggar's rags seemed to fall away, and the suitors found themselves staring not at a stranger, but at the king of Ithaca himself, home at last, an old grievance 20 years in the making, now standing in his own hall with a bow already strung. What followed does not need to be told in detail, only that the doors had already been quietly sealed, that Telemachus stood armed at his father's side exactly as planned, and that by morning the hall that had rung for years with the suitors feasting had gone completely, permanently silent. Even then, Penelope, cautious after 20 years of hoping and being wrong, would not simply accept that the battle-marked stranger before her was truly her husband, and she tested him once more, asking a servant to move the bed in their marriage chamber. A bed Odysseus himself had built around the trunk of a living olive tree so many years before that it could never be moved without destroying it entirely. Only the real Odysseus would know that, and when he gave the one true answer, that the bed could not be moved because he had built it around a growing tree with his own hands as a young man. Penelope's caution finally broke, and she crossed the room and embraced him at last, 20 years and every impossible danger, finally, fully over. What had it cost him? 10 years of war, 10 more of monsters and grief, 6 men lost to Scylla, hundreds to giants and gods, a decade in which his son grew from infant to man without him. Odysseus never described the journey home as glorious, and perhaps that is the most honest thing about his story. Home was never a place he simply returned to, but something he had to earn back, piece by piece, test by test, until an old scar and an olive tree proved what a crown and a kingdom alone never could. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.